Welcome back. Emergency trip. President Biden is in Europe right now amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine to meet with NATO allies and European partners to discuss defense, deterring Russian aggression, and talking about the strategy ahead.
I'm going to say all I have to say, I'm going to say when I get there.
In today's episode, we'll talk about the president's trip so far, what he hopes to achieve, how Russia is responding, and we'll also provide an update on the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Today, March 25th, 2022. From Anchor by Spotify, this is the Ishan S. Show, a podcast about the interesting and ever-changing world of American politics, all from the perspective of a 15-year-old. With me, your host, Ishan. Welcome to the Ishan S. Show. I'm so glad to have you all back on today. You know, it's like the first time, I think this year really, that I've had a regular episode come out. 2 consecutive episodes come out. Like, it's a big deal, guys. But anyway, now, if you haven't noticed, the past few episodes that have come out, I've kind of been doing this thing where I give you an update on other political news stories that are happening that don't necessarily pertain to the topic of the episode. Now, I've been doing that for a while, and I kind of like that, so we're going to make that a permanent addition of the show. So here are some major political news updates before we get into the actual story. So the biggest headline this week, I'm pretty sure many of us know, was about Ketanji Brown Jackson, President Biden's nominee for the Supreme Court, who just finished her confirmation hearings. I did write about it in the Political News blog if you want to check that out. By the way, the Political News blog is actually operational again. I know, great news. And now I'm going to make every effort to be as robust as I can in rolling out those posts. So stay tuned for those. But anyway, back to Judge Jackson. The hearings concluded yesterday, and she faced some tough questions from senators, mainly on the right. They challenged her on her stances over critical race theory, abortion, affirmative action, I believe, also came up. And something that really made headlines was how so many senators also challenged her rulings as a lower court judge on sentences for child predators. That became a really contentious part of the whole thing. I think specifically we were talking about Senators Marsha Blackburn and Josh Hawley, of course, that were really bringing this up. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell announced that he will not be supporting Judge Jackson's nomination to the High Court. It's not surprising that he wasn't going to do that. I highly doubt Judge Jackson is going to get any Republican votes. She might get a few, but just seeing the type of political climate we're in, I don't think it's going to benefit any Republican to actually, make the political decision to support a Democrat president's nominee. Right. So I'm not surprised that Mitch McConnell declared that he isn't supporting her. But Joe Manchin came out today and said that he would be voting to confirm Judge Jackson. So I think really Democrats, I don't think they actually really need to worry anymore about her nomination, because if Joe Manchin's on board, then you can assume every Democrat is on board. And so they get that 50 votes, or they get those 50 votes for Jackson, and then Kamala Harris, the vice president, breaks the tie. So I think Judge Jackson has it sealed. I believe the official committee vote and or Senate vote, actually, all together, will happen before Easter when they go on break. So we'll probably have Ketanji Brown Jackson get confirmed as a Supreme Court justice sometime in the middle of April. So stay tuned for that. Then former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, the first woman to hold the position, died at the age of 84 from cancer early Wednesday. In a statement from her family, they said, quote, "She was surrounded by her family and friends, and they called her a tireless champion of democracy and human rights. Our thoughts are with the Albright family as all of us across the country mourn Secretary Albright's loss." The January 6th committee is making headlines again. They plan on holding two advisors of former President Donald Trump, Dan Scavino and Peter Navarro, in criminal contempt. If you want to know exactly what that means, then after this episode, go to my episode from earlier this year, I think January 7th, where I cover the January 6th committee's work and explain what criminal contempt of Congress actually means. There's also news coming out of the West Wing as new reports from New York Times reporters Jonathan Martin and Alexander Burns are surfacing of Vice President Kamala Harris's staff and President Biden's staff not getting along. And they also talk a lot about the mass exodus of staff members from the White House, specifically from the vice president's office, in recent weeks and months. That's West Wing gossip. It's something that plagues all of Washington, D.C., where they just love talking about how staffs don't get along with each other. And I guess Vice President Kamala Harris and President Biden are victims of that in this presidential term. It used to happen it happens all the time. But anyway, you can read more about this story in the New York Times or in Politico or something. Okay, those were some headlines in the political world this past week. Now let's get on this week's top story, which is President Biden's sudden trip to Europe that started yesterday. So before we get into this, I should just say that in the previous episode, I made clear some of my views on this matter relating to the Ukraine crisis. So for transparency's sake, I do suggest you listen to me explain some of my views on this before you hear my report here. But anyway, back to Biden. President Biden scheduled an emergency NATO summit over the weekend after Russia started ramping up their efforts in Ukraine. Now, Vladimir Putin's been ramping up his forces in Ukraine for a while, for the past few weeks, because in reality, he's losing. Most people did not expect Ukraine to, last as long as it has. But the spirit and the morale of the Ukrainian people is inspiring and impressive. They've been able to successfully hold back Russian troops in so many parts of the country. The siege of the city of Mariupol, which is a really important city on the southern coast of Ukraine, that city, Mariupol, is under siege. And even as that is underway, Russia is continuing to make blunder after blunder, and they are not able to take the city. And in fact, I believe just moments ago, I learned that Russia just lost control, at least partial control, of another major city, one of the early cities that they took over. So this is not working out for Russia right now, and they keep making blunder after blunder in this invasion. That's why they've been ramping up their attacks now. Now Putin's forces are attacking civilians in schools, hospitals, bomb shelters, and all of it's being done indiscriminately. Russia said that they would not attack civilians. They agreed on this sort of not ceasefire necessarily, but this agreement with Ukraine when they did meet to, just not attack civilians. But they still continued to do it. And even after they said they wouldn't, and even after everyone is begging them not to, they keep doing it. The UN put out chilling numbers recently and about the Ukraine crisis. And one of those numbers was about civilian casualties from this war. The UN says that Putin's forces have killed over 1,000 innocent Ukrainian civilians. That's a really horrifying number to think about. And these are mainly, if not all, because of Putin's military forces, because they're going into this country, they're doing all these missile strikes, they're launching these attacks on civilian groups. It's happening, and they keep denying that they're doing it, and they keep saying that they'll try not to, but it happens. They keep doing it. So they are, as President Biden said, committing war crimes. There have also been some threats to the homeland that I feel has also pushed Biden in this direction to go for that Ukrainian summit. I think the most prominent of those factors are the credible threats of cyber warfare in this conflict. You know, the first episode of the show focused on cyber attacks, and the one after that, I think the episode right after that, second episode, it was about President Biden meeting with Vladimir Putin. And one of the topics that they were going to discuss was cyber warfare, among other things. So in a statement issued on Monday, President Biden said, quote, "I have previously warned about the potential that Russia could conduct malicious cyber activity against the United States, including as a response to the unprecedented economic costs we've imposed on Russia alongside our allies and partners. It's part of Russia's playbook." And then he went on to write, quote, "If you have not already done so, I urge our private sector partners to harden your cyber defenses immediately by implementing the best practices that we have developed together over the last year." End quote. I think it was this in combination with a series of other things that really prompted President Biden to request our NATO allies to meet for this emergency summit. Now, many experts and analysts are calling this trip, President Biden's trip, one of the most important presidential trips, not just in Biden's presidency, but in fact, one of the most important presidential trips in modern history. Now, people say that all the time, and then there are others who have this tendency to ignore that and say, no, it's not as important. They're blowing it out of proportion. And yes, it does happen. Analysts will always blow things out of proportion. But I don't think they're going to be doing that with this one. I think with this trip, they're spot on about the importance of this trip and just how crucial it is. Setting the stage here, Russia is a nuclear power that has launched this unfounded and unfair invasion into its neighbor Ukraine, the second largest country in all of Europe, second only to Russia itself. This invasion is also the largest ground invasion on European soil since World War II. There should be no doubt that this invasion, is the most consequential geopolitical event of the 21st century thus far. It needs to be treated that way as well. So President Biden's trip to Europe to diffuse the situation is so darn important. I don't think a lot of people understand the impact of this trip. President Biden is meeting with NATO leaders to discuss how we respond to Russia's behavior. We need to keep in mind that Vladimir Putin planned his war in the hopes that NATO and the West in general would not be united. We would be this disunited force and would be confused and unsure about how we were supposed to address this or combat Russia. However, our response and this trip have proven that that notion absolutely incorrect. I mean, yes, there are minor disagreements here and there, but for the most part, we are united in stopping this invasion. So this summit with President Biden and leaders of our NATO allies is very important, as we've come to understand. But what are we going to get out of it? How successful is it going to be? What message is this going to send to Vladimir Putin, if any? These are all questions that I'll try to answer when we come back. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short break. Okay, we're back. So before the break, we were talking about the scope of President Biden's trip. Now let's talk about everything that has actually unfolded. So President Biden departed the White House on Wednesday morning to board Air Force One to go to Belgium, where the NATO stuff was going to happen. Before he left, though, Biden briefed members of the press pool at the White House. Here's a clip of that.
I'm going to say all I have to say, I'm going to say when I get there. But I'll be happy to talk to you guys when I get back. How many are you coming? They're there.
Do you have any message?
I know.
Do you have any message for Vladimir Putin?
President, how concerned are you about the threat of chemical warfare right now, that Russia will use chemical weapons? How high is that threat?
I think it's a real threat.
So that was a concerning statement by the president about the use of chemical weapons, saying that they're a real threat in this conflict. Putin's already unleashed this attack on innocent civilians. It's not that surprising to conceive of the notion of Vladimir Putin at least considering using chemical weapons to attack innocent people in Ukraine. But anyway, after landing in Brussels, the president was welcomed by Prime Minister Alexander De Croo. They didn't do much, of course, since it was nighttime, but the next day, President Biden had a lot of things on his schedule. He met with, I think, all NATO leaders for that emergency summit. He then met personally with NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. After that, President Biden met with G7 leaders. Now, the G7 leaders meet one another often. It's a common thing. But they haven't met together in person, I believe, since June, when I covered this back then. Covered their last G7 summit. I think it was actually President Biden's first trip in general, foreign policy trip. So it's significant. Now, over the course of this trip, after meeting our allies and partners who are helping us combat, this conflict, President Biden announced a series of steps that the United States would be taking to further address the crisis in Ukraine. One of the biggest announcements to come from this is that President Biden announced that the United States would be accepting 100,000 new refugees from Ukraine. The Ukraine crisis has created over 3 million refugees, easily making this one of the biggest humanitarian crises of our time. But beyond that, President Biden also announced that the U.S. would be adding to our list of sanctions against the Russian government for their invasion. President Biden said that the U.S. would be sanctioning 400 members of the Russian elite and government to further pressure Vladimir Putin to stop the atrocities that his military is committing. And then lastly, the last major development to come out of this is when President Biden met with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. In that meeting, they agreed on some new measures to bolster EU energy independence by reducing the EU's reliance on Russian fossil fuels. Now, look, it's important to recognize just how reliant Europe has been on Russian oil and natural gas, and to some extent ourselves. After this war started, we imposed sanctions on banking, oligarchs, politicians, etc. in Russia. But we also, in that process, while not directly, we did indirectly also rupture the status quo when it comes to gas prices. The price of a barrel of oil was significantly hiked because the entire oil market went into this sort of frenzy because Russia is really important to the global energy sector. Surprise. That's why gas prices have also been high up here at home as well. So a lot of what our meetings have been about, with our European allies is about decreasing our reliance on Russian energy and Russian fuel because they've been trying to use Russia, their oil and their fuel as some sort of leverage to get us to stop. And as long as we come to, rely on that, we are going to continue to face problems because crude oil prices have gone up significantly. And Russia will make money from that if we continue to buy from them. So I think a very important step for the United States and for the West in general is to decrease that reliance. And I think that's why President Biden has been working so hard with our European allies, as he did with the EU chief, to decrease their reliance on oil because we want to decrease Russia's leverage altogether. I believe there is also a motion here in Congress, back here at home, to actually ban the import of all Russian oil. I'm not exactly sure where that is right now, but I believe it already passed the House. So if that changes, you can probably check my Twitter or you can check the political news blog. It'll probably be somewhere, or if not, it might be in next week's episode. Who knows? So decreasing the reliance on Russian oil is going to be very important around the world as it pertains to fuel prices. Now, that's a snippet of President Biden's time in Brussels. Yesterday, he also held a press conference to discuss cooperation efforts as well as where Russia stands in this war here and what it's been doing thus far. Here's a bit of the president's press conference.
Today marks 1 month since Russia began its carnage in Ukraine, the brutal invasion of Ukraine. And we held a NATO summit the very next day. At that time, my overwhelming objective in wanting that summit was to have absolute unity on 3 key important issues among our NATO and European allies. First was to support Ukraine with military and humanitarian assistance. Second was to impose the most significant sanctions, economic sanction regime ever, in order to cripple Putin's economy and punish him for his actions. Third was to fortify the eastern flank of our NATO allies, who were obviously very, very concerned and somewhat worried of what would happen. We accomplished all 3 of these, and today we're determined to sustain those efforts and to build on them. Many Ukrainian refugees will wish to stay in Europe, closer to their homes, but we also will welcome 100,000 Ukrainians to the United States with a focus on reuniting families. And we will invest $320 million to bolster democratic resilience and defend human rights in Ukraine and neighboring countries. We're also coordinating with the G7 and the European Union on food security as well as energy security. And I'll have more to say about that tomorrow. We're also announcing new sanctions of more than 400 individuals and entities in alignment with the European Union. More than 300 members of the Duma, oligarchs, and Russian defense companies that fuel the Russian war machine.
The real threat of chemical weapons being used. Have you gathered specific intelligence that suggests that President Putin is deploying these weapons, moving them to position, or considering their use? And would the U.S. or NATO respond with military action if he did use chemical weapons?
You know, on the first question, I can't answer that. I'm not going to give you intelligence data, number one. Number two, we would respond. We would respond if he uses it. The nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use.
Do you think that Russia needs to be removed from the G20?
On the latter point, my answer is yes. That depends on the G20. That was raised today, and I raised the possibility if that can't be done, if Indonesia and others do not agree, then we should, in my view, ask to have both Ukraine be able to attend the meetings, as well as basically Ukraine being able to attend the G20 meeting and observe.
So that's what's happened so far. Now what? Well, President Biden will, I believe, go to Poland to visit the prime minister there. In Poland, the administration said in a statement that Biden would discuss future cooperation efforts as well as strategies to combat continued Russian aggression. And Poland is a really important ally because they border Ukraine, and they are just so close to Russia itself. So, looking after them is going to be very important for our efforts, for NATO efforts and for U.S. efforts. And so another major thing that the president will be doing is visiting refugees in Poland who have escaped Ukraine. Let's not forget that most of the refugees coming out of Ukraine are going into Poland. And as I said earlier in the episode, that's numbered at around 3 million refugees. That's a lot of people. The Polish people have been great about this, though, and they're welcoming Ukrainian refugees with open arms, and they are helping out. And, it's not just in Poland. People all around the world are working so hard to help these people because, life has, changed for the Ukrainian people. Complete 180. I think you could say 2 months ago, they were at home. They went to work. They went to school. They had parties. They met each other. Just 1 month later, President Putin, Vladimir Putin, had single-handedly changed the course of the lives of these people. So I'm glad to see the work that so many people are doing to help Ukrainians who are fleeing their country because of what Vladimir Putin has done. And I did say this in my previous episode, and I'll say it again. If you can, try to look for some places to help out this effort, donating or posting on your social media, helping out in some way or form. It will help out the Ukrainian people, I'm sure, in some way. But back to the trip, Biden also talked about him meeting with these refugees in the press conference that I mentioned earlier. Here's a clip of Biden on the refugees.
Because you're heading to Poland tomorrow, do you think that getting a firsthand look at the effects of this war on these millions of Ukrainians who have fled their country could change the way that you might respond?
I don't think so, because I've been to many, many war zones. I've been in refugee camps. I've been in war zones for the last 15 years, and it's devastating. And but the thing you look at the most is you see these young children. You see children without parents that are in those camps or in refugees. You see women and husbands, men and women who are completely lost and have no nose. You see the look, that blank look on their face, that absolute feeling of, my God, where am I? What's going to happen to me? And so what it will do, it will reinforce my commitment to have the United States make sure we are a major piece of dealing with the relocation of all those folks, as well as humanitarian assistance needed both inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine.
So here's my take overall. We're in this sort of unusual time in terms of our foreign policy, and we're also at this point where news can be made in an instant when it comes to this crisis. Last time we talked, there were no plans for President Biden to meet NATO leaders in any sort of emergency summit. There were only a few reports and rumors of the White House seriously discussing something like this, but there were no plans. Yet here we are today talking about the actual emergency summit that happened. The point I'm trying to make is that right now, the Ukraine crisis needs to be watched for all the things that are unfolding. There is so much that is happening every single day, every single week, where we never thought of that happening. I mean, nobody really thought that Ukraine would last this long anyway. That is one of the biggest headlines from this entire situation. Ukraine's resistance and their resilience. The way they've been able to sustain and the way they've been able to hold on to their territory and resist the Russian military's invasion is another example of the surprising events that come out of this, that have been coming out of this crisis. This moment is historic. We haven't seen something like this in a while. And Putin was kind of running on the hope that NATO would not unite. But he was proven wrong. NATO and Ukraine have the upper hand in this conflict. I mean, look, Ukraine is winning this right now, for right now anyway. Ukraine has been able to push them back. Mariupol, we talked about earlier. We talked about that other city that Russia lost control of. But now, as NATO and Ukraine have taken the upper hand, President Biden is emerging as the leader of this alliance. And it's really up to him how he respond and whether or not the claims he made on the campaign trail about his foreign policy expertise prove to be true. We'll be watching that. And so that does it for us here at the Ishan S. Show today. If you liked my commentary, then go ahead and follow at Ishan_show on Twitter and at the Ishan S. Show on Instagram for breaking news posts and updates about the show. If you want to learn more about political stories, then check out my political news blog on the IshanSshow.com. Do us a favor and share this episode and all the others with your friends and family. It's the best way for this show to grow and get more people listening to it. Thanks again for all your support, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.